I need to tell you about the window. Not the broken ones on the ground floor that I seal with plywood and roofing tar during the first week, and not the shattered storefront glass that lined Grafton Street like teeth knocked loose from a jaw. The window I need to tell you about was on the fourth floor of a water treatment facility in Deerfield, Wisconsin, a town of about 14,800 people, 60 miles northwest of Milwaukee. And it faced east, and every morning for 100 days I sat beside it and watched the sun come up over a city that no longer belonged to anyone who breathed. That window is where I wrote the journal. And the journal is the only reason I'm able to tell you any of this in an order that makes sense, because memory, it turns out, is a lousy archivist. Memory edits. Memory skips. Memory takes the worst night of your life and compresses it into a feeling without details, and takes a random Tuesday where nothing happened and preserves it in crystalline specificity for no reason at all. The journal doesn't do that. The journal is a ledger. It says what happened, when and what I did about it, and it does not care whether the entry is interesting or important or flattering to the person who wrote it. My name is Wendell Grady. Most people called me Dell, except my mother, who insisted on the full name because she'd chosen it after her grandfather and felt that shortening it was a form of disrespect to a man who'd survived the Korean War and built a house with his hands in a Wisconsin winter. I was 43 years old. I'd spent 22 of those years working for the Deerfield Municipal Water Authority, the last 9 as a senior systems operator, which meant I was the person who understood how the treatment plant worked at a level that went beyond valve positions and chemical dosing schedules into the actual architecture of the thing. The pipe routing, the structural load paths, the electrical distribution, the fail-safe systems and their fail-safe backups, and the manual overrides that existed for when even the backups failed. I mention this because the plant is why I survived, and understanding the plant is how you'll understand the decisions I made, the ones that kept me alive and the ones that almost didn't. I was divorced. Tamara and I had split 4 years earlier in the way that people split when neither one has done anything unforgivable, but both have done enough small forgivable things that the accumulated weight finally exceeds the structure's capacity. She'd moved to Portland, Oregon, with our daughter, June, who was 15 at the time the outbreak hit, and who I spoke to every Sunday evening on a video call that lasted exactly the duration of her patience, which was typically 11 to 14 minutes. June had her mother's directness and my stubbornness, which made her formidable in arguments and exhausting in negotiations, and the single most important person in my world, despite the 1,900 miles and a custody agreement that gave me 6 weeks in the summer and alternating holidays. The last call I had with June was on a Sunday, 18 days before the outbreak reached Deerfield. The infection was in the news by then, but it was East Coast news, Philadelphia and Newark and Baltimore, and Wisconsin felt like watching a house fire from across a lake. Close enough to see the flames, far enough to believe the water would stop them. "Dad, are you watching this stuff?" June asked. She was in her bedroom in Portland. I could see the poster behind her, some band I didn't recognize, and the stack of books on her desk that she was working through for AP English. "I'm watching it. Mom says it's going to get bad. Your mom's smart. She's usually right. She wants us to go to Aunt Kathy's place in Bend. It's more rural. She says cities are going to be the worst." "That sounds like a solid plan, Junebug." "Don't call me that." "Sorry. Force of habit. Are you going to be okay?" "In Deerfield. I'll be fine. How about the plant? It's built like a fortress." I said it casually, almost as a joke. The water treatment facility was a running source of humor between us because June had visited it twice during summer custody weeks, and both times she described it as the most depressing building in America, which wasn't entirely unfair. It was a concrete and steel industrial facility built in 1974, expanded in 1991, and maintained with the grim functional efficiency of a municipal utility that never had quite enough budget and always had more infrastructure than it could prettify. But it was solid. Poured concrete walls 18 inches thick on the lower levels. Steel-reinforced doors on the mechanical rooms. A roof-mounted water tank holding 22,000 gallons. And because it was a water treatment plant, it had the one resource that every survival scenario ultimately depends on: clean water, processed, and stored in quantities that a single person could stretch for years. I didn't know I was describing my future home. But some part of my brain, the part that had spent 2 decades understanding the building systems, was already running calculations that my conscious mind wouldn't catch up to for another 12 days. Dad, seriously, if it gets bad, go somewhere safe. I will. Promise. I promise. She ended the call the way she always did, with an abruptness that I'd learned not to take personally because 15-year-olds treat goodbyes as an inefficiency to be eliminated, and the affection lives in the call itself, not in the closing. I tried calling her 9 days later. The cell networks in the Pacific Northwest were degraded, but partially functional, and I got through to Tamara's voicemail. I left a message. I said I love them. I said to stay in Bend. I said I was safe. I tried again 2 days after that. The network was gone. Not degraded. Gone. The kind of silence that doesn't mean busy signals or dropped calls, but means the infrastructure carrying the signal has stopped existing in a functional capacity. I don't know if Tamara took June to Bend. I don't know if they made it. I don't know if Kathy's rural property provided what rural properties are supposed to provide in these scenarios, which is distance from population density and time to prepare. I don't know anything about my daughter's status, and I haven't known for over 100 days, and the not knowing is a specific kind of weight that I carry in a specific location in my chest, slightly left of center, slightly below the collarbone, and it has not gotten lighter with time. It has simply become structural, part of the architecture, load-bearing, like everything else I've built my survival around. Day 1 in the journal is May 27th. I need to back up slightly. The outbreak reached Deerfield on May 24th, a Friday, and it arrived the way most things arrive in small Midwestern cities, through the highway. A family from Milwaukee, 4 of them in a Chevy Suburban packed with luggage, fleeing the infection reports that had started appearing in the metro area 2 days earlier. They stopped at the Quick Trip on Route 12 for gas. The father was already symptomatic, though nobody recognized the symptoms because the behavioral profile of early infection, irritability, confusion, fixation on movement, and sound, looks remarkably like an exhausted man who's been driving for 2 hours with 3 scared family members and no plan. I didn't witness what happened at the Quick Trip. I heard about it secondhand from Pete Molina, one of my co-workers at the plant, who'd been across the street at the hardware store when the screaming started. By the time I understood what had happened, there were 6 confirmed infected in Deerfield, and the number was doubling every few hours because the first hours are when the math is cruelest, when each new case is a multiplier applied to a population that hasn't yet learned to hide. I spent May 24th and 25th at my house, a 2-bedroom ranch on Elm Court, boarding windows and monitoring the news on my phone until the cell network started fragmenting. My neighbor, Rick Sobieski, came over on the 25th with his wife, Patty, and asked if they could shelter with me. Rick was 58, retired from the paper mill, a decent man with bad knees and a hunting rifle he hadn't fired in 6 years. Patty was 61, a retired dental hygienist who brought a casserole, because Patty brought a casserole to every crisis, and the world ending did not, in her view, constitute an exception to social protocol. I told him yes. We boarded at my house together. Rick's knees made him slow on the ladder, but his hands were steady, and he drove nails with the mechanical competence of a man who'd spent 30 years in a mill where imprecision cost fingers. On the night of May 25th, we heard the first infected on our street. I was awake. I hadn't slept since the 24th, and the sound came through the boarded windows with a clarity that the plywood did nothing to muffle. Footsteps on asphalt, but wrong. Arrhythmic. The gait of a body moving without the neurological software that coordinates human locomotion into something fluid. And then a second set, and a third, and then a sound against Rick's front door for houses down that lasted for 11 minutes before it stopped. We sat in my living room in the dark, the 3 of us, listening. Patty held Rick's hand. Rick held his rifle across his lap with a grip that was too tight for a man who knew how to hold a weapon, which told me his body was overriding his training with a fear response that tightened everything. How many do you think? Rick whispered. Hard to say. Several. The Millers aren't boarded up. Or the Chens. I know. Should we? No. We stay inside. We stay quiet. There's nothing we can do for them right now that doesn't put us at risk. He looked at me with an expression that I recognized because I was wearing a version of it internally. The expression of a person who knows the right tactical answer and hates themselves for how easily it comes. The Millers had 2 kids under 10. The Chins were elderly. And we were sitting in my living room doing the math that says 3 people behind boarded windows have a better survival probability than 3 people in the open trying to rescue neighbors from a threat they don't fully understand. I wrote this in the journal later, in the margin of the first entry, in handwriting that was smaller than the rest, because the observation felt like something that should be said quietly. The hardest part of the first night was not the sounds outside. It was discovering how quickly I could calculate the value of an action. Day 3, May 27th, the day I moved to the plant. My house was not sustainable. I knew this by the morning of the 26th when I inventoried what we had. Canned goods for maybe 2 weeks if we rationed. 40 gallons of water in the bathtub I'd filled before the pressure dropped. No generator. No renewable water source. A residential structure with windows, interior doors, a garage door that was the weakest point in the entire envelope, and walls that were standard stick frame construction. 2x4 studs, plywood sheathing, vinyl siding. A determined human with a pry bar could breach it in 10 minutes. The infected were less coordinated than a human with a pry bar, but they were more persistent, and persistence beats technique when time is not a factor. The water treatment plant was 3 miles east, on the edge of town, backed up against conservation land that stretched north into farmland and forest. I'd driven to work there 5 days a week for 22 years. I knew every room, every pipe, every circuit breaker, every access point. And I knew, with the specific confidence of a man who maintained the building's systems, exactly how defensible it was. I told Rick and Patty the plan at 6 a.m. on May 27th. 3 miles, Rick said. He wasn't questioning the distance. He was translating it through the filter of his knees. We could drive. My truck's in the garage. And if the roads are blocked, then we walk. 3 miles at your pace, Rick, maybe 90 minutes. We stay on residential streets as long as we can, then cut through the Holbrook farm property to approach from the north. The plant service entrance is on the north side. I have my key card, and if the electronic lock is dead, I have the manual override code. Patty had already started packing. She moved through my kitchen with the organized efficiency of a woman who had spent her professional life preparing treatment rooms. Systematic, nothing wasted, nothing overlooked. She packed every can, every bottle, every packet of dried food, every medication from my bathroom cabinet into bags and boxes with a density that maximized volume in a way I wouldn't have thought to attempt. I'm bringing the casserole dish, she said. We might not have an oven, Patty. The dish is Corningware. It works on a camp stove, in a fire, or in a solar oven if it comes to that. I've had this dish since 1986, and it has never let me down, which is more than I can say for most of the people I've known. I didn't argue. You don't argue with a woman who survived 4 decades of marriage, a career in dental hygiene, and the end of the world without losing her Corningware. We loaded my truck, a 2019 Ford F-150 that had 74,000 miles on it and a half tank of gas, and opened the garage door at 6:22 a.m. The street was empty, not quiet. The birds were active, a detail that surprised me because I'd expected the wrongness of the situation to extend to nature, but nature was indifferent. Robins on the lawn, a cardinal in the oak tree, the same morning sounds that had accompanied every commute I'd ever made to the plant, now accompanying what might be my last one. We drove. I took a route I'd planned on paper the night before, avoiding Main Street and the commercial district where population density would correlate with higher infected presence. Residential streets. Oak Lane to Birch to the county road that skirted the town's eastern edge. We passed 4 houses with open doors, 2 cars and ditches, a bicycle on its side in the middle of Birch Street with one wheel still spinning, which meant whoever had been riding it had stopped riding it very recently. At the intersection of Birch and County Road I saw the first infected since the sounds on the first night. A woman in a bathrobe standing in the middle of her front yard, facing the street, motionless. The dormant posture I'd read about in the fragmented news reports that had come through before the networks died. She was oriented vaguely toward the road, her head tilted at an angle that didn't quite work anatomically, her arms at her sides. No movement, no breathing visible from the truck's distance of maybe 40 yards. I slowed the truck to a crawl and eased past. The engine noise was unavoidable, but at low RPM, the F-150's exhaust was more hum than roar. The woman's head tracked us, a slow rotation, maybe 15 degrees following the sound. But her body didn't move. No step toward us. No shift in posture from dormant to active. The stimulus was below whatever threshold triggered pursuit. We cleared the intersection. In the rearview mirror, the woman remained her yard, head now oriented in our direction, body still. That was Mrs. Anderson, Patty said from the back seat. Her voice was steady, but the sentence carried a specific gravity that had nothing to do with the words. Helen Anderson, Patty's friend, book club, 30 years of shared Tuesday evenings. Now, standing in her bathrobe in her front yard, her head tracking the sound of a truck with the mechanical orientation of a radar dish. The plant appeared at the end of the county road like something I was seeing for the first time despite having seen it 4,000 times before. The chain-link perimeter fence. The parking lot, empty except for 2 vehicles that belonged to the night shift operators who had been on duty when everything fell apart. The main building, squat and gray and ugly and beautiful in the specific way that buildings become beautiful when they represent the difference between exposure and shelter. I pulled the truck up to the service gate on the north side. My key card worked. The plant's power was still live, running on the municipal grid, which in Deerfield was fed by a natural gas power station that was, I assumed, still operating on automated systems. I drove through, parked against the building's north wall, and we unloaded in 7 minutes. The service entrance opened into the mechanical corridor on the ground floor. Fluorescent lights on. The hum of the filtration systems still cycling. The building was functioning, doing its job, treating water for a city that had largely stopped needing it, with a blind institutional persistence of infrastructure that doesn't know it's been orphaned. I locked the service door behind us. Steel frame, steel door, deadbolt rated for institutional security. Then I walked the building. I should back up, no. Actually, I should go forward, but slowly, because the walkthrough of the plant is when I understood what I had, and understanding what I had is what let me survive what came next. The Deerfield water treatment plant was built in 2 phases. The original 1974 construction was a single-story concrete structure housing the primary filtration and chemical treatment systems. The 1991 expansion added a second story with administrative offices, a break room, a small mechanical workshop, and a control room with monitoring systems for the entire water distribution network. A third level, accessible only by an external steel staircase, housed the rooftop equipment, the 22,000-gallon storage tank, HVAC units, and a communications antenna array that the city had installed in 2018 for emergency coordination. Ground floor, concrete walls, 18 inches thick, poured in forms with rebar grids on 16-inch centers. I knew this because I'd reviewed the as-built drawings dozens of times during my career. 3 exterior doors, the service entrance on the north, a loading dock on the west, and an emergency exit on the south. The loading dock door was a roll-up steel model, heavy gauge, motorized but also manually operable. The emergency exit was steel in a steel frame with a panic bar interior and no exterior hardware. I locked and barricaded the loading dock door using a technique I developed mentally during the drive, threading a length of chain from the maintenance shop through the door's track guides and padlocking it. The door could still be forced, but it would require sustained pressure against the chain's tensile strength, and the chain was rated for lifting equipment that weighed considerably more than any number of bodies pressing against the door. The south emergency exit I secured with a crossbar fabricated from a piece of 2-inch steel pipe I cut from a spare inventory in the workshop. The pipe fit across the door frame in brackets that I welded from angle iron. The weld work was rough. I'm a water systems operator, not a welder, and the small MIG unit in the workshop was a tool I'd used maybe 6 times in my career, always for pipe repairs, never for security fabrication. But the welds held when I tested them, and held is the only standard that matters. Second floor. Standard commercial construction above the concrete base. Metal stud framing, drywall interior, but with an exterior cladding of precast concrete panels that provided more resistance than residential siding. Windows on the east and south faces, the vulnerability I liked least. I boarded them from inside using plywood sheet from the workshop storage, fastened with screws rather than nails because screws hold under sustained pressure and nails pull out. The window I kept was the one on the fourth. Actually, let me correct that. I've been saying fourth floor, but the plant doesn't have a fourth floor. The rooftop level is a maintenance platform with a parapet wall and the equipment housing. When I say the window, I mean the east-facing window on the second floor control room. I kept it unboarded because it was 12 feet above ground level, too high for the infected to reach without climbing ability they didn't possess, and because I needed it. I needed to see outside. I needed to see the sun come up. The tactical value of observation was real, but the psychological value of natural light and visible sky was something I didn't fully appreciate until the third week, when I realized that the days I didn't sit at that window were the days my thinking got dark enough to frighten me. Rick and Patty settled into the break room on the second floor. It had a couch, a microwave, a refrigerator that was still running on grid power, and a coffee maker that Patty immediately commandeered with the proprietary confidence of a woman claiming her domain. "We need a schedule," she said. "Meals, watches, maintenance. Without structure, people dissolve." She was right. I knew she was right because I'd already been feeling the pull of dissolution, the gravitational drag of a crisis that is too large to solve and too present to ignore, which creates a paralysis that disguises itself as vigilance. You sit, you watch, you listen. You do nothing productive because the emergency feels like it requires constant readiness, and constant readiness is actually constant stillness, and constant stillness is how you lose your mind. We made a schedule. I wrote it on the whiteboard in the control room. 0600 wake. Water check. Perimeter visual scan from east window. 0700 breakfast. 800 to 1200 maintenance, fortification, system checks. 1200 lunch. 1300 to 1700 projects, inventory, planning. 1700 dinner. 1800 to 2100 free time, reading, talking. Whatever kept the silence from becoming a third occupant. 2100, night watch begins. 4-hour shifts. Dell, Rick. Patty objected to being excluded from the watch rotation. I'm 61, not dead. I can sit in a chair and listen for sounds. You're right. I'm sorry. I know I'm right. Adjust the schedule. I adjusted the schedule. The first 10 days were fortification and inventory. I'll give you the numbers because the numbers are what I came back to every night in the journal, the concrete facts that anchored the days when the facts were all I had. Water, functionally unlimited. The plant's treatment systems were still operational on grid power, processing water from the municipal wells. I had 22,000 gallons in the rooftop tank alone, and the wells, drilled into the sandstone aquifer at 340 feet, would continue producing as long as the well pumps had power. When the grid failed, I had a backup. The plant's emergency generator, a diesel unit, could power the essential systems, including one well pump for approximately 19 days on the 1,100 gallons of treated diesel in the underground storage tank. Beyond that, I could collect rainwater on the roof's flat surface, roughly 4,200 square feet, and run it through a gravity filtration system I could build from the plant's spare filter media. Food. This was the problem. Between my kitchen supplies, Patty's packing, and the break room's vending machine inventory, we had roughly 23 days of food at 2,200 calories per person per day. The vending machine contained 19 bags of chips, 14 candy bars, 8 packages of crackers, and 6 granola bars. I inventoried each item individually and recorded the calorie counts in the journal because the difference between 23 days and 20 days could be a person's life, and precision was the only tool I had against the slow arithmetic of depletion. Fuel. The plant's diesel tank held 1,100 gallons. My truck had a half tank, roughly 11 gallons. I siphoned it into a 5-gallon can and stored it in the workshop because the truck parked against the building, was a resource I might need for mobility, but not one I could afford to leave fueled and tempting if other survivors found the plant. Medical. Patty's contribution was critical here. She'd packed my entire medicine cabinet plus her own, which included prescription blood pressure medication for Rick, over-the-counter painkillers, antibiotic ointment, bandages, and a dental emergency kit that she'd assembled herself and which contained instruments I didn't want to think about needing, but was grateful existed. Weapons. Rick's hunting rifle, a Remington model 700.308 with a scope and 37 rounds of ammunition. A fire axe from the plant's emergency station. A collection of hand tools, hammers, pry bars, heavy wrenches, that could serve as weapons in close quarters. And a hunting knife that Rick kept on his belt and sharpened every evening with a whetstone he'd brought, the rhythmic scraping sound becoming the auditory signature of our evenings. A sound I found oddly calming because it was purposeful and steady and human. I knew from day one that the food situation would force a decision. 23 days. The plant could keep us alive on water indefinitely, but water without calories is a slow death that begins with weakness and ends with the kind of cognitive decline that makes every other survival task impossible. I needed to forage. I needed to go outside, but not yet. For the first 10 days, I stayed inside and learned the building the way a person learns a body. Not the anatomy already knew, but the personality. The sounds it made at night, when the temperature differential between the concrete mass and the cooling air created expansion joints that clicked and groaned. The way the morning light entered the east window at a slightly different angle each day as the sun tracked north toward the summer solstice. The specific pitch of the filtration pumps at different flow rates, which became a baseline against which I could detect anomaly. A change in pump tone meant a change in system pressure, which meant either a valve had shifted or a pipe had developed an issue, and either one required attention because the water system was not a convenience. It was the reason the building was worth occupying. Rick settled into a routine that revolved around maintenance and radio monitoring. He'd found a battery-powered AM/FM radio in the break room junk drawer and spent hours scanning frequencies, finding mostly static, but occasionally catching fragments of distant broadcasts that confirmed the outbreak had spread beyond anything the early news reports had suggested. One fragment, received on day 7, was a FEMA automated broadcast on a loop, providing coordinates for a coordination point in Madison, 60 miles southeast. The broadcast was faint, the signal degrading, but it was a voice, and voices mattered more than their content, because content could be outdated or wrong, but the existence of a voice meant the existence of a person, and the existence of a person meant the existence of hope at whatever distance hope was currently operating from. Patty organized. That was her survival mechanism, and it was more effective than any fortification I built. She organized the food stores into a system so precise that she could tell me, at any moment, exactly how many calories remained, how many days that represented at various consumption levels, and which items should be eaten first based on expiration proximity. She organized the medical supplies into a treatment station in the break room. She organized the sleeping arrangements, claiming the couch for herself, and Rick, and insisting I take the floor of the control room, where the carpet was industrial grade and unforgiving, but where I could monitor the building's systems through the night. She also organized something I hadn't thought to organize, which was time itself. On day 5, she produced a deck of cards from her overnight bag, the same bag she brought to my house during the first night, packed with the overnight essentials that a 61-year-old woman considers non-negotiable even during societal collapse, which apparently included a deck of bicycle playing cards, a travel-sized bottle of hand lotion, and a paperback mystery novel she'd been halfway through for 3 weeks. We played rummy after dinner. Every night, the 3 of us around the break room table, Patty dealing with the sharp efficiency of a woman who'd been playing cards since Kennedy was president, Rick studying his hand with the tactical concentration he'd previously reserved for deer season, and me. I played badly and gratefully because the hour we spent on card was the hour the silence retreated, and the silence, by day 5, had become an adversary more persistent than anything outside the walls. Day 14 was when Rick fell. He was helping me inspect the rooftop equipment, The HVAC units needed filter checks, a routine maintenance task that I'd been performing quarterly for years, and that the outbreak had not relieved me of because the air handling system was what kept the building's interior climate livable. The external staircase to the roof was steel, bolted to the building's east face, with anti-slip treads that had weathered 20-plus Wisconsin winters and were developing rust in places that compromised their grip. Rick's right knee, the worst of his two bad knees, buckled on the third step from the top. He went down sideways, his hip hitting the stair rail, his body folding around the railing in a way that sent him sliding down 4 steps before I caught his arm. The sound he made was not a scream. It was a compressed vocalization, the sound of a man who has lived with chronic pain for years and has developed an internal protocol for managing its spikes that involves swallowing the scream and converting it to a grunt, because screaming is an admission of limitation, and Rick Sobieski did not make admissions easily. I got him down the stairs. Patty examined him in the break room with the clinical focus of a woman whose professional training, while dental and specialty, had included enough general medical education to assess musculoskeletal injury. His right hip was bruised, possibly fractured. His right knee, already compromised, had swollen to a size that made bending it impossible. He lay on the couch with his leg elevated on Patty's overnight bag. His face gray with pain, he was managing through a combination of ibuprofen and the sheer stubbornness that had characterized his approach to every physical challenge since his knees first started failing a decade ago. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not fine. I'm not dead. In the current context, that qualifies as fine." Patty looked at me from across the room. Her expression conveyed what her words didn't. Rick was not going to recover from this quickly, and in a situation where mobility was survival, a person who couldn't move was a person whose survival depended entirely on the people around him. I wrote in the journal that night, Day 14. Rick fell. Hip and knee. He can't climb stairs. He can't run. He can barely walk. The math hasn't changed yet, but the variables have. I am now the only person who can go outside. The foraging started on day 16. I'd spent 2 days planning the first run, mapping routes on a hand-drawn layout of Deerfield's eastern neighborhoods that I'd sketched from memory and the plant service maps. The residential area nearest the plant was Meadowbrook, a development of single-family homes built in the late 90s, roughly half a mile west. Beyond that was the commercial strip on Route 12. Quick Trip, a Dollar General, a hardware store, a small grocery called Hensler's Market. Hensler's was the target. A full grocery store, even a small one, contained months of preserved food if it hadn't been looted, and Deerfield's eastern commercial strip was far enough from the population center that I hoped, the looting had been less thorough than the areas closer to downtown. I left at 5:08 a.m. First light. I carried a backpack, the fire axe, and Rick's knife. I left the rifle with Rick because separating a man from his weapon when he can't run felt like removing his last agency, and agency, even symbolic, was something I couldn't afford to take from him. The half-mile to Meadowbrook took 22 minutes because I moved at a pace that prioritized silence over speed. The streets were empty in the early light, but the emptiness was not clean. Doors open. A car parked on a lawn with its headlights still on. The battery somehow not dead after 2 weeks. A dog, a beagle, alive, thin, watching me from a porch with the wariness of an animal that had learned in a very short time that not all bipedal figures were friendly. I stopped and looked at the beagle, and the beagle looked at me, and we arrived at a mutual understanding that neither of us was a threat. And then I moved on. Look, I should tell you about the dog. I'll come back to the dog. Hensler's Market was locked. The front glass was intact, which meant it hadn't been breached by infected or looted by survivors. I used the fire axe on the service entrance in the back, a steel door with a standard commercial lock that yielded to focused strikes on the latch area in a way that was louder than I wanted and faster than I expected. I stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, listening, the axe raised, my breathing controlled through a pattern I taught myself during the first week. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. The box breathing technique that someone had mentioned in one of the fragmented radio broadcasts as a tool for managing fear, which I dismissed at the time as self-help nonsense, and which I now used roughly 40 times a day because it worked and I was no longer in a position to be dismissive of anything that worked. The store was untouched. Rows of canned goods, dry pasta, rice, beans, peanut butter, honey, powdered milk, crackers, cereal. A pharmacy section with over-the-counter medications, vitamins, first aid supplies. A hardware aisle with batteries, flashlights, duct tape, rope. It was, and I mean this without exaggeration, the most beautiful room I had ever entered. More beautiful than the church where Tamara and I got married. More beautiful than the delivery room where June was born. Because beauty, I was learning, is not about aesthetics. It's about the relationship between what you need and what you find. And when the need is survival and the find is a fully stocked small-town grocery store, the relationship produces a feeling that I can only describe as sacred. I cried, briefly, standing in the canned goods aisle at 5:40 in the morning with a fire axe in one hand and an empty backpack in the other. Then I stopped because crying doesn't fill backpacks, and I filled the backpack. I made the mistake on the way out. I was loaded. The pack weighed probably 45 pounds, stuffed with canned goods, rice, a bulk container, peanut butter, batteries, and a bottle of ibuprofen for Rick. The weight shifted my center of gravity and made my footsteps heavier, and heavier footsteps are louder footsteps, and I was so focused on the relief of having found food that I forgot, for maybe 90 seconds, the discipline that had kept me alive for 16 days. I came around the corner of the building and walked directly into the line of sight of two infected standing in a parking lot. They were maybe 30 yards away. A man and a woman, both in civilian clothes, both in the alert, dormant middle state that I'd come to recognize. Not fully motionless, but not actively pursuing. Heads slightly forward. Weight distributed for movement. Waiting for the stimulus that would tip them from passive to active. I provided the stimulus. My boot on the gravel of the service drive crunched with a sound that carried in the morning stillness like a gunshot, and both heads snapped toward me simultaneously, and the transformation from dormant to active was instantaneous and terrifying not because of its speed, but because of its completeness. One moment, two figures standing in a parking lot. The next, two figures moving toward me with a direct, obstacle-indifferent gait that the infected used when they'd locked onto a sound source. I ran, or rather, I moved at the fastest pace the 45-pound pack would allow, which was a heavy jog that felt grotesquely slow against the closing distance. The infected weren't fast. I want to be clear about that. They moved at a walking pace, maybe 3 miles per hour, but they moved without hesitation and without the fatigue that would slow a living person, and the gap between 3 miles per hour and my loaded jog was smaller than the gap between 3 miles per hour and my unloaded sprint. And the pack was staying on because the pack was food and food was life, and I was not dropping it. I made a decision that in retrospect was stupid and at the time felt like genius. Instead of heading straight back to the plant, which would have led the infected toward our shelter, I turned north into the Meadowbrook neighborhood and used the residential streets to create distance and break their line of sight. The infected track by sound when they can't see you, and residential streets with houses and fences and parked cars create acoustic shadows that confuse their directional orientation. It worked. After 4 blocks of weaving through Meadowbrook, I stopped behind a garage and listened. No footsteps, no crashing. The infected had lost the trail, or had reoriented toward a different stimulus, or had returned to dormancy. I waited 5 minutes, counting each second, then took a circuitous route back to the plant, approaching from the north, entering through the service door, and locking it behind me with hands that were shaking badly enough that the key card took 3 tries to swipe. Rick was in the control room, watching from the east window. Saw you running. Well, jogging. It wasn't fast. Thank you, Rick. Very helpful. Patty wants to know if you got peanut butter. I got peanut butter. Then she says you're forgiven for whatever you did wrong. I wrote in the journal. Day 16. First foraging run. Hensler's intact. Enough food to last months if I can keep making runs. Made a mistake. Got careless on exit. Drew 2 infected. Evaded through Meadowbrook. Lesson. Weight changes everything. Noise discipline must account for load. Next time, lighter pack. 2 trips if necessary. No shortcutting the protocols because you're relieved. Relief is a drug. It makes you stupid. The foraging became a routine. Every 4 to 5 days, I made a run. Sometimes to Hensler's. Sometimes to houses in Meadowbrook, where I found additional supplies in kitchens and pantries and garages. More food, propane canisters for a camp stove Patty had requested, blankets, a Coleman lantern, books. I brought back books every trip. Patty consumed them voraciously, reading by lantern light after dark with the focused appetite of a woman who had discovered that fiction was the only vacation available when the real world had become uninhabitable. Rick read too, slower, mostly non-fiction, a biography of Eisenhower that I found in someone's living room, a field guide to Wisconsin birds that he studied with an attention that seemed disproportionate until I realized he was using it to identify the species we could hear from the building, which gave him a form of environmental awareness that compensated for the mobility he'd lost. I should tell you about the dog now. Day 23. I was coming back from a run to Meadowbrook when I saw the beagle again, the same one from the first trip. It was thinner. It was sitting on the same porch, but the posture had changed from wary to something closer to resigned. The bowl beside it was empty. The house's door was closed. Whoever had lived there had either left or stopped being someone who could fill a bowl. I had jerky in my pack. I put a piece on the ground 10 feet from the porch and walked away. Day 26. The beagle was at the edge of the porch. I put jerky closer. 8 feet. Day 30. The beagle took the jerky from my hand. Day 33. The beagle followed me back to the plant. I didn't plan it. I didn't encourage it. The dog simply made a decision that the person who kept bringing food was a better survival strategy than the empty porch, and it got up and walked beside me with the pragmatic loyalty of an animal that has done the cost-benefit analysis and chosen the option that includes regular meals. Patty named him Biscuit. I objected on the grounds that Biscuit was a ridiculous name for a survival companion. He's a beagle, not a Navy SEAL, Patty said. Biscuit. Rick sided with Patty. Biscuit's a fine name. It's dignified. It is not dignified. More dignified than Wendell. Biscuit it was. The dog changed the building's ecology in ways I hadn't anticipated. He slept beside Rick on the couch, providing warmth that Rick's circulatory system, compromised by inactivity and injury, needed more than any of us acknowledged. He alerted to sounds outside with a low growl that preceded my own awareness by seconds, effectively extending our perimeter detection range. And he provided something that I cannot quantify in a journal entry, but that I will try to describe here. The presence of a living thing that was simply present, without agenda, without fear, without the weight of knowledge about what the world had become. Biscuit didn't know about the outbreak. Biscuit knew about food and warmth and the hand that scratched behind his ears, and the simplicity of his needs was a counterweight to the complexity of ours. The grid failed on day 39. I'd been expecting it. I've been preparing for it since day one, running through the switchover procedures in my head, testing the backup generator weekly, maintaining the diesel fuel with the stabilizer compounds I had in the plant's chemical stores. But expecting a thing and experiencing it are different categories of knowledge. And when the fluorescent lights flickered at 2:17 a.m. and then went dark with a finality that had physical weight, the darkness that replaced them was not the darkness of a power outage. It was the darkness of an era ending. Every light that had gone dark was a light that an automated system somewhere in the power distribution network could no longer maintain, and the cascade of those failures, rippling through a grid designed for human oversight that no longer had human oversight, had finally reached Deerfield. I was in the control room. I moved by flashlight to the generator room on the ground floor, started the diesel unit. It caught on the second attempt, coughing to life with a mechanical protest that smoothed into a steady 1,800 revolutions per minute drone and transferred the essential circuits. The well pump, the control room instruments, the break room outlets, not the lights. I couldn't afford the fuel consumption of lighting the entire building. I allocated 2 overhead fluorescents, one in the control room and one in the break room, and the rest of the building went dark. The generator consumed roughly 5.5 gallons per day at the reduced load I'd configured. With 1,100 gallons in the tank, that gave me approximately 200 days of essential power. But I didn't want to run it 200 days. I wanted to run it as little as possible and supplement with manual systems. So I built a schedule. Generator on for 4 hours in the morning to pump water into the rooftop tank and charge the battery bank I'd assembled for vehicle batteries I scavenged from the parking lot. Generator off for the remaining 20 hours. We lived on stored water and battery-powered lights, and the camp stove that Patty operated with a mastery that suggested she'd been preparing for off-grid cooking her entire life without knowing it. Day 41. I wrote, "The dark changes things. Not just visibility. Psychology. The building feels larger in the dark. The sounds are louder. The distance between rooms becomes a journey instead of a walk. Patty sings while she cooks now. Hymns, old ones, the kind with 4-part harmonies that she knows all the parts to, and sings sequentially because there's no choir. Rick sharpens his knife. Biscuit lies by the door. And I sit at the window and watch a city that is completely dark for the first time since electricity reached it, and the stars above it are so bright and so many that I understand, viscerally, what light pollution was stealing from us. The stars were always there. We just couldn't see them through the glow of our own making. Day 50 was the day I should have died. I was on a foraging run, deeper than usual, into the commercial area west of Route 12. I'd exhausted the easy targets. Hensler's was mostly cleared out. The Meadowbrook houses had been picked over across multiple trips. I needed to range further, which meant more exposure time, more distance from the plant, more unknowns. The Dollar General on Route 12 was my target. Canned food, batteries, hygiene supplies. I approached from the back, as always, and found the service door already open. Not broken, open. Propped with a brick. Someone else had been here. Recently. I should have turned around. The protocol I'd written in the journal, the protocol I developed through 33 days of foraging, said clearly, if a site shows signs of recent human activity, withdraw and reassess. Other survivors are unknown variables. Unknown variables in a resource-scarce environment are threats until proven otherwise. I didn't turn around. I went in because I was tired and hungry, and the cognitive discipline that had kept me alive was eroding under the cumulative weight of 50 days of fear and isolation and the slow, grinding anxiety of not knowing whether my daughter was alive. And when discipline erodes, mistakes fill the space it leaves. The store was partially looted, but still useful. I was filling my pack in the canned food aisle when I heard the voice. Stop. I stopped. The voice was male, coming from the end of the aisle, and when I turned, I saw a man standing 15 feet away with a pistol pointed at my chest. He was maybe 30, thin, unshaven, wearing clothes that had been lived in for weeks. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. The eyes were the part that scared me, because steady hands with unstable eyes meant a person who was physically capable of pulling the trigger and emotionally unpredictable about whether they would. Put the pack down. I put the pack down. The axe, too. I set the fire axe on the floor. That food is mine. I've been working this store for 2 weeks. Look, I didn't know. I'm from the water plant east of here. I'm not trying to take your territory. Territory. He laughed. The laugh was short and contained no humor. Territory. Like we're animals. I didn't respond to that, because responding to the philosophy of a man holding a gun on you is a luxury that the geometry of the situation doesn't permit. What I did instead was look at him. Really look. The thinness. The hollowness around the eyes. The way his left hand, the one not holding the pistol, tremored faintly. He was alone. He was malnourished. And he was afraid, not of me specifically, but of everything, the ambient existential terror that saturates every waking moment when you're surviving alone, and every sound could be the sound that ends it. You look like you haven't eaten in a while. Don't. I'm not doing anything. I'm observing. It's what I do. I'm a water systems operator. I observe systems. And the system I'm looking at right now is a person who's running on empty. I said don't. I have a place. Concrete walls. Running water. Clean. There are 3 of us. And a dog. We have food. Not a lot, but we share it. You can keep the pack. But if you want more than what's in that pack, you should come with me. He stared at me. The pistol didn't waver, but the eyes did. The eyes were doing the calculation that every person in this scenario eventually does, the weighing of trust against survival. The assessment of whether the risk of believing a stranger is greater or lesser than the risk of remaining alone. How do I know you're not lying? You don't. That's what trust is. The decision to act before you have proof. I'm aware that this sounds like something from a self-help book, and at the time, standing in a Dollar General with a gun pointed at me, the words felt absurd even as they left my mouth. But they were also true, and truth has a weight that people recognize even when they're too afraid to trust it immediately. His name was Corey Phelps. He was 28. He'd been a delivery driver for a medical supply company based in Waukesha before the outbreak, and he'd been sheltering alone in a self-storage unit half a mile south of Route 12 for over 3 weeks. He had the pistol, a Smith & Wesson M&P Shield with 11 rounds remaining, and the clothes on his back, and the partial inventory of the Dollar General, and nothing else. He lowered the gun, not all the way, to his side, still gripped. The trust was conditional and incomplete, which is exactly the right amount of trust for the first meeting with a stranger during a zombie outbreak. I took him back to the plant. I did not take him inside immediately. I had him wait at the perimeter fence while I went in, told Rick and Patty, and we discussed it. Patty wanted to know if he was injured or sick. Rick wanted to know about the gun. I told them what I'd observed. Young, alone, malnourished, armed, afraid. Bring him in, Patty said. But he eats after we've talked to him, and the gun stays visible. I don't trust pockets. We brought him in. He sat at the break room table, and Patty put a bowl of rice and canned chicken in front of him, and he ate with the controlled desperation of a person who wants to shove the food in, but is aware that he's being observed and is trying to maintain whatever dignity survival has left him. Biscuit walked up to Corey and put his head on Corey's knee. Corey looked down at the dog, and his face did something that faces do when the last defense against emotion is breached by a gesture of unconditional acceptance from a creature too simple to have an agenda. What's his name? Corey asked. Biscuit, Patty said. Good name. I looked at Patty. Patty looked at me. The naming consensus had expanded. Corey stayed. He wasn't easy. He was suspicious by default, guarded in conversation, reluctant to share information about his background beyond the basics. He kept the pistol on him at all times, which Rick tolerated because Rick understood that a man's weapon is a man's autonomy, and asking him to surrender, it was asking for a trust that hadn't been built yet. But over the next weeks, he became part of the system. He was young and strong and could carry more than I could on foraging runs, which doubled our efficiency. He had mechanical aptitude from his delivery truck maintenance experience, and he helped me overhaul the generator's fuel filter system when it started showing pressure drop symptoms that would have eventually caused a failure. And he talked to Patty more than any of us late at night in the break room, conversations I could hear fragments of from the control room, him telling her about his mother in Waukesha, who he hadn't been able to reach, and Patty telling him about her sons, both in the military, both stationed overseas, both beyond any communication she could establish. Their shared unknowing, both carrying the weight of family members whose status was a permanent question mark, created a bond that I observed with the clinical attention of a man who watches systems, and also with the gratitude of a man who understands that systems work better when their components are connected. Day 65. I wrote, 4 people and a dog in a water treatment plant. It's not a community. It's too small for that word. But it's something. A unit. A household. We eat together, work together, argue about cards together. Patty cheats, and we all know it, and no one says anything because the cheating is part of the ritual and rituals are sacred now. Rick's hip is healing slowly. Corey smiled today for the first time since he arrived. Biscuit stole a piece of jerky from my pack and showed no remorse. The stars are still bright. I still don't know about June. The midsection of the 100 days was defined by a rhythm that I began to trust, which was itself a form of danger, because trust in a pattern creates the assumption that the pattern will continue, and assumptions are the soil in which complacency grows. We foraged. We maintained. We lived. The infected population in our immediate area seemed to thin as the weeks progressed, consistent with what I'd read about the pathogen's host lifespan, 10 to 14 days of active mobility, after which metabolic depletion rendered them immobile and eventually inert. New infected appeared only when living humans were present to be turned, and As the living human population of Deerfield diminished through death, evacuation, or sheltering, the rate of new infection slowed. By day 70, I could walk to Hensler's and back without encountering a single active infected, though the dormant ones, the ones standing in yards and parking lots at intersections, motionless, waiting for a stimulus that might never come, were everywhere. I learned their positions the way a sailor learns rocks in a harbor. I navigated around them. I knew which ones were truly dormant and which were in the lighter sleep that could be triggered by a footstep at 20 yards. Day 82 was the radio. Corey had been working on the plant's rooftop communications array, the one the city had installed in 2018. It was designed for municipal emergency coordination, UHF and VHF repeater systems with a range that depended on atmospheric conditions and antenna height. Our antenna was at roughly 50 feet above grade, which in flat Wisconsin terrain gave us a theoretical line of sight range of about 8 miles, more with atmospheric ducting. Corey got it working. I don't fully understand what he did, something with the power supply and the antenna cabling, but at 7:14 p.m. on day 82, the speaker in the control room produced a voice. Madison Coordination Point, FEMA and Wisconsin National Guard. Safe zone established at Alliant Energy Center. Any survivors in surrounding counties, we are receiving on this frequency. Repeat, we are receiving. The four of us stood in the control room and listened to the loop play 3 times. Nobody spoke. The voice was real and present and human, and it was saying words that meant other people were alive and organized and trying to rebuild something from the wreckage. Patty cried. She turned away from us and faced the wall, and her shoulders shook and nobody touched her, because the tears were not the kind that want comfort. They were the kind that want privacy. The release of a pressure that she'd been containing since the first night, managed through casserole dishes and card games and organizational discipline, now breaching the wall because the wall was no longer necessary at its full height. Rick looked at me. 60 miles to Madison. I know. My knees. I know. Ow. I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. Corey was already at the map table. He'd pulled the Wisconsin highway map from the plant's emergency reference binder and was measuring distances with a ruler and a pencil. Route 12 goes most of the way, or we could take back roads through Dane County. Fewer population centers, but the roads might be blocked. We didn't go immediately. I spent 4 days planning the route, assessing our vehicle options. My truck was still functional, but fuel was finite, and preparing supplies for the journey. I also spent those 4 days at the window, watching the city, writing in the journal, and sitting with the feeling that leaving the plant meant leaving the only place that had kept us alive, and that leaving a place that has kept you alive requires a trust in the future that the past 100 days had systematically worked to dismantle. Day 87, I wrote, "We're leaving the plant. Not today. Soon. The Madison signal is real. We've confirmed it across 3 frequencies, and the broadcast includes updated timestamps, which means active human operation, not just a recorded loop running on battery backup. The plan has been everything. Home, fortress, water supply, salvation. And now it needs to be something else, a waypoint, a chapter, not the end of the story. I'm not sure I'm ready for it to not be the end of the story. I've gotten comfortable here, which is exactly the reason I need to leave. Comfort in a survival situation is just stagnation wearing a pleasant expression. Day 90, we left. The journey to Madison is its own story, longer than I can tell within the scope of what I'm telling you now. I'll say this, it took 3 days. The truck got us 41 miles before we ran out of fuel outside a town called Mezomany, where we found a Ford Explorer in a farm driveway with a quarter tank of gas and the keys in the cup holder, which is either a miracle or a statistical inevitability, depending on your relationship with probability. Rick rode in the back with his leg elevated. Patty navigated from the passenger seat with the highway map and a red pen she used to mark every obstacle, every blocked road, every abandoned vehicle cluster that forced a detour, creating a document that was part navigation chart and part archaeological record of a civilization's final traffic jam. We encountered infected 11 times during the journey. Most were dormant. 2 groups were active. 1 cluster of 5 near a truck stop outside Sauk City that Corey and I evaded by driving through a soybean field and one solitary figure that appeared on the road directly ahead of us, and that I drove around at a speed that was reckless on the deteriorating pavement, but necessary given the alternative. We reached Madison on day 92. The Alliant Energy Center was visible from 2 miles out by the flags. American flags and Wisconsin state flags mounted on temporary poles along the perimeter, a visual signal designed to communicate one thing from maximum distance. This is us. This is human. Come here. They processed us at the gate. Medical check. Name, registration. Weapons logged, but not confiscated. A woman in National Guard uniform gave Patty a bottle of water, and Patty held it like it was made of crystal. Not because water was scarce. We'd had more water than anyone, but because the bottle was clean and labeled and produced by a system that still functioned, and the existence of that system meant that the world had not ended. It had contracted, but it was still there. I spent 8 days at the Madison coordination point before I found the board. The board was in the main hall of the convention center, a wall 40 feet long covered with paper, notes, photos, names, messages. A low-tech social network for the end of the world. People looking for people. The handwriting varied from precise to desperate. Some notes had photos attached. Some were just names and dates and last known locations. I walked the board every day, scanning for names I knew. On day 100, I counted. I found a note pinned near the center of the board. Written in handwriting I recognized instantly because I'd watched it develop from the shaky letters of a first grader to the confident script of a teenager. Dad, we made it to Bend. MOM and me and Aunt Kathy. We're okay. I knew you'd be okay too because you told me about the plant and you never lie about buildings. I love you. Come find US when you can. June. I stood at the board and read it 4 times. Then a 5th. The handwriting. The logic. I knew you'd be okay because you never lie about buildings. My daughter. Parsing my reliability through the filter of my professional competence. Trusting the specific expertise she'd witnessed during those summer visits to the plant she'd called the most depressing building in America. I pressed my forehead against the board, against the paper, against my daughter's handwriting, and I let the 100 days arrive at once. The weight of them, the window, the journal, the dark, the stars, the dog, the foraging runs, and the mistakes, and the moments I should have died and didn't. Rick's fall and Patty's hymns, and Corey's pistol lowered an inch at a time as trust built in increments too small to measure and too important to ignore. A hand on my shoulder. Patty. She'd seen the note. She read it over my shoulder and made the sound she'd made at the radio. That compressed exhalation of relief, so total it mimics pain. Bend, Oregon, she said. That's a long way. Yeah, you'll go. Yeah, good. Biscuit and I will hold down the fort. The journal's last entry is day 100. I wrote it at a desk in the convention center, with Biscuit asleep at my feet and Patty playing cards with Rick and Corey at a folding table nearby, and June's note folded in my shirt pocket against my chest where I could feel its edges through the fabric. Day 100. Found June's note on the board. She's alive. She's in Bend with Tamara and Kathy. I don't know when I can get there. I don't know what the route looks like or how long it will take or what I'll find between here and Oregon. But I know the destination, and I know she's there, and I know that 100 days ago, I sat at a window in a water treatment plant and watched the sun rise over a dead city and wondered if there was a reason to keep watching. The reason was pinned to a board in a convention center in Madison, Wisconsin, written in the handwriting of a 15-year-old girl who trusted her father's knowledge of buildings and didn't call him Wendell. The journal is closed now. The book is full. 100 days and 100 pages, written in a hand that got steadier as the days went on, not because the fear diminished, but because the hand learned to write through it. I'll start a new journal tomorrow. Day 1 of whatever comes next. The window at the plant faced east. Every morning, the sun came up. Every morning, I watched it. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Not because it was hopeful, though some mornings it felt that way. I watched it because it was consistent. Because the sun does not know about outbreaks or infected or the slow collapse of everything humans built. It rises because rising is what it does, and in the absence of every other certainty, that one was enough. It was enough to get me to day 2. And day 2 was enough to get me to day 3. And somewhere around day 40 or 50, I stopped counting the days as a measure of endurance and started counting them as evidence. Evidence that the system held, that the walls held, that the water flowed, that the people around me, imperfect and afraid and stubborn in their own specific ways, held each other up in the manner that humans have always held each other up. Not heroically, not dramatically, but daily, in small, persistent acts of showing up and staying and doing the next thing that needed doing. 100 days, 100 pages, a window facing east, and a note on a board that said, "Come find us when you can." I can now,